very good morning and welcome to the ISIS forum titled The Quad at Southeast Asia, Reception, Perception and Opportunities. This forum is organized in conjunction with the Australian High Commission in Malaysia and seeks to focus on the implications of the Quad in this region in Southeast Asia. So we have two sessions today structured around the strategic security implications of the Quad and the opportunities for the Quad in Southeast Asia beyond a strategic security dimension, looking at areas like trade, tech, climate change, and even pandemic mitigation. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Shariman Lokman, the Director of the Chief Executive's Office at ISIS, for his welcoming remarks. Shariman.
Thank you, Thomas. Welcome everyone to this event. We are very pleased to be doing this with the Australian High Commission. So when this event was first proposed, it sort of like brought me back to discussions we had actually quite some time ago in 2005, 2006. And this was actually not about the Quad, but for something called the East Asia Summit, well, the East Asia Summit. So, and this was, we had quite a rough, almost, very heated discussion, especially in Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, China, about what the East Asia ought to be, who should be in, who should be out, what the East Asia should talk about. Is it a key part of the East Asian community? A very quaint concept looking back now. And so I was very puzzled because I was a very junior researcher about why these people sort of like arguing about who should be sitting in which conference room, and later realized that, well, it wasn't really about the format or anything like that they were arguing about. It was what the format meant. It was what the format represented. It was, if you had a certain view of the East Asia Summit, it also tells people what you thought about China, what you thought about ASEAN, what you thought about the actual, what is the ideal regional security architecture for the region. And so we are back here talking about the Quad, and it's got some of the similar elements. If you believe in the Quad, if you believe that the Quad is a useful part of the regional security architecture, it tells you a bit about what you think about China, what you think about India, tells you a bit what you think about ASEAN perhaps, or what people might think about what you think about ASEAN. And so, it's the underlying, it's sometimes discussions about formats, about conferences, about meetings like this. It's actually a proxy for a wider discussion, a proxy for a discussion on the rise and fall of great powers, I don't know, maybe. A proxy discussion about whether ASEAN is truly effective and worthy enough to be running the show in Southeast Asia. And so this makes for an interesting discussion, I think, and I think we will have a very good session this morning. And for this, I would really like to reiterate our, sincere thanks to the Australian High Commission for their collaboration in putting this event together. I would also like to convey the warm regards of my Chief Executive, Mr. Harizal Hazri. I'm speaking on his behalf today. He is unable to join us because of pressing issues, pressing meetings to attend. So, I'm just filling on his behalf. But really, thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers for joining us this morning. We are really looking forward to a great discussion. Back to you, Thomas.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Shariman. That was quite a throwback, I think. So, yeah, I didn't expect that in your welcoming remarks. So now I pass the floor to His Excellency Dr. Justin Lee, the Australian High Commissioner in Malaysia, for his welcoming remarks. Dr. Lee, take it away.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you to Shariman. It's a real honour and pleasure to be here today and to be able to make some opening remarks and to also see so many esteemed colleagues and participants from around the region and from Malaysia and elsewhere. We're just very pleased that the Australian High Commission is able to partner again with ISIS, as we've done on many occasions previously, and really do applaud the contribution that your organisation makes to public discourse including on the really significant issues that we face in the region. So really looking forward to today's discussion and think that it'll also be very valuable. I just want to note at the outset that, of course, the most significant issue we're all facing at the moment is COVID-19, of course, and really, again, express appreciation for all of the international cooperation that is occurring and from Australia's perspective as well. Sharing experiences and helping one another out at this time is particularly important, and we're really pleased that that's going on as we seek to recover on both the health and the economic grounds. Alongside of that, of course, though, the big issues don't go away, and we're having to deal with them, and they interconnect with what we're facing at the moment. And of course, one of the big issues that we're all encountering at the moment is the strategic transformation that is occurring, that's underway, as there's this strategic and economic weight shifting towards the Indo-Pacific region. I know that discussion has been covered by many of us, by both officials and academics and commentators alike, and that's been the subject of many of the webinars and other discussions like the one we're having today. And we think that a real noteworthy component of those discussions, including here in Malaysia, has been the Quad, and note that it has generated a lot of questions, and it's really timely to have a discussion of this type. I think the sorts of questions that have arisen over the Quad are really understandable at the moment. It's a relatively new grouping, and one that's become increasingly active, including in dealing with the day-to-day practical challenges that we're facing. And people, of course, want to understand where it fits into the architecture that we have. No doubt there's also been a degree of apprehension and misunderstanding. People are thinking about how the Quad will work, including with the region's key institutions, and want reassurance that it won't take away, for example, from ASEAN centrality. And regrettably, there are others that have been saying some very inaccurate things about it, including assertions that it's irrelevant, right through to those claims that it's a military alliance with designs on becoming a new Asian NATO, I think is the sort of terminology that's used. Neither of those are true, of course, and the Quad is a diplomatic network that's already making a positive difference to our region, and that it's working to support an open, resilient and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Its momentum's growing. There have been Quad foreign ministers meetings, and there's been agreement to hold those regularly, and Quad leaders have committed to meet again before the end of this year. The Quad, in terms of what it is intended to complement and support the participants' bilateral relationships and the work that's rightly led by ASEAN and inclusive ASEAN-centred institutions like the EAS. And indeed, Quad countries champion ASEAN centrality and the ASEAN outlook of the Indo-Pacific. And it has an agenda that's practical and constructive, focused on, at the moment, vaccine production, responding to climate change, and critical and emerging technologies, along with other long-standing regional priorities like maritime security, cyber, counterterrorism, infrastructure, humanitarian and disaster relief, and countering disinformation. So I really hope that today's discussions will allow a deeper dive on all of the issues that are raised, not just by myself, but in the broader public discourse on the Quad, and in particular, generate further insights on how the Quad can best work with and complement ASEAN-led efforts in our region. So again, thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you, Shariman, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion today. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for your remarks. Folks, we're now going to commence the first session of this forum, which is titled Alliance Building on Like-Minded Cooperation, Viewing the Quad in Southeast Asia. Before I turn it over to Shariman and Sinatra, who will be co-moderating, please allow me to remind you all on the following. Session 1 will take place from 9:40 to 10:50 at KL time. It's going to be followed by a 10-minute break till 11 o'clock Kuala Lumpur time. And then session 2 will commence from 11 till 12:10, and the forum will end shortly after that. If you have any questions or comments, please do use the Q&A function. With that, Shariman and Sinatra, you have the platform. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Thomas, and hello again. Yeah. So we have a fantastic set of speakers in this session: alliance building or like-minded cooperation, viewing the Quad in Southeast Asia. So I'll be well, actually, I will ask Mr. Sinatra to take over from me soon after I introduce the speakers. Well, discussants, we're calling them. This first discussant is Ms. Haley Chena, Senior Policy Fellow of the Perth US-Asia Center in Australia. What I'll do is I'll introduce all of them, and we'll pass it on to Sinatra later. Second discussion is Dr. Kay Koga, an old friend of mine, a fellow alumnus of the Pacific Forum Young Leaders Program, Koga-san. He's now Assistant Professor, Public Policy and Global Affairs at the NTU. Third discussion is a new colleague of mine, very promising and very smart as hell, Ms. Angeline Tan, a researcher with the Foreign Policy and Security Studies Program at ISIS Malaysia. Fourth discussion, we are very privileged and honored to have, of course, we are privileged and honored to have everyone, but especially privileged and honored to have Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar, research of LIPI, and also, of course, the Habibi Center. Yes, so I'll pass it on to Sinatra, if you can just take over and relieve me of this heavy responsibility.
Thank you, Shariman. It's takeover time by me. My name is Sinatra. I'm an analyst in foreign policy and security studies, and I'll be assisting all of you in navigating this first session titled Alliance Building or Like-Minded Cooperation, Viewing the Quad in Southeast Asia. Considering we only have around 66 minutes left and we have 4 speakers, I will jump straight to the first speaker, Ms. Haley Chena, who will be delivering her speech or her presentation for around 10 minutes. Then I'll pass it on to the next speaker. So Ms. Chena, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sinatra, and thanks very much to ISIS Malaysia and the Australian High Commission in Malaysia. I am dialing in from freezing lockdown Canberra, and I so wish I was in KL right now. Besides the fact that I miss traveling there, I miss the times when I could travel around all of Southeast Asia and visit some of my friends over there. So I just wanted to congratulate ISIS and also the High Commission for holding this event at such an opportune moment. Last night, India's Minister for External Affairs, Dr. Jaishankar, gave a very special address for Julie Bishop, part of the J.G. Crawford oration on the Quad. And also on Friday last week, Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison confirmed that he would in fact attend the second Quad Leaders Summit before the end of this year in Washington, DC. So it's a perfect time to be discussing the Quad. Just a little bit about me so that I can have some credibility with you, the participants, and also the audience. For the last 9 months, I've been working for Gordon Flake at the Perth US-Asia Center. Prior to that, I was at the Department of Defence in Australia for 5 years. And I've also spent time working for the Minister for Defence, who is our current Foreign Minister now, Maurice Payne. And for the last 3 months, I have full-time worked on a new project for the Perth US-Asia Center. It's a paper called Roadmap to Quad Success. And to research this report, I spent the last 3 months in Canberra interviewing senior Australian and foreign government officials, as well as think tank analysts and academics on the Quad. And I, in total, had about more than 30 interviews with these people. So I'm delighted to be able to share my findings with you. And my Perth US-Asia Center report doesn't come out until next week. So I'm actually giving you all a sneak peek of my findings. So I've been asked to speak on the Australian perception of the Quad and also talk about what Australia, the United States, and other Quad countries can do to increase regional support for the Quad. So first of all, let me address this issue of the Australian perception of the Quad. what has struck me really is that in Australia, there is some hangover about the history of the Quad framework, and in particular, the stoppage in Quad meetings between 2008 and 2017. So Australia's former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, for example, speaks a lot and spends a lot of time talking about who is really responsible for the halt in the dialogue, and was it really Australia's fault, or was it really the United States' fault? And to me, that's quite an interesting insight, because as a former Prime Minister, it surprises me, with such a large amount of time having passed since 2008, the Quad is a totally different framework now. And I'm intrigued as to why we still languish about what happened in the past rather than looking to the future of the Quad. And what that says to me as an analyst is that there's some sense in Australia that our country is responsible for the damage caused to the Quad's credibility, and also casting a bit of a shadow over its future and also its prospects for sustainability. Now, within Australian government agencies themselves, I spoke to a lot of people over the last 3 months. And I also spoke with many Southeast Asian high commissions and embassies here in Canberra. And in their perspective, Australia is doing some things right, and some things could be improved upon in terms of the Quad. The biggest praise Southeast Asian nations had for Australia, more than any other Quad country, was that Australia has excelled in terms of providing Southeast Asian nations with pre-briefs prior to Quad meetings, as well as post-meeting briefs. So many Southeast Asian embassies and high commissions were very complimentary about the Australian government's efforts to keep them informed, as if this was a no surprises policy. So there's definitely something that Dr. Lee and his High Commission can be proud of. And the biggest area that Australia and the Quad generally could improve was in terms of providing more information about what the Quad is actually going to do, and whether there is scope for Southeast Asian nations to have the option to be included in those plans. So at the historic March Leaders Summit earlier this year, the Quad flagged that it was going to do a number of new things. It made a pledge to deliver 1 billion COVID-19 vaccines to the region by the end of 2022. And it also established working groups on climate change and critical and emerging technology. Now, the highest priority of Southeast Asian nations was for the Quad to deliver on that 1 billion COVID-19 vaccine commitment. Talking about this commitment, one Southeast Asian friend of mine said, and I quote, "The Quad vaccine pledge was probably the most high-profile announcement any group could launch this year given the circumstances, and it's understandably generated much excitement and hope in the region. However, progress has been held up largely due to the main vaccine producer creating a bottleneck, and it will be interesting to see if the Quad can really pull this off." So that's a direct quote. And what that tells me is that Southeast Asian nations aren't really sure if the Quad can deliver what it says it's going to do. And of course, no one saw the Delta strain coming, but you would still hope that with Australians being early next year looking at getting their booster shots, that we would be able to deliver on our commitment for Southeast Asian nations and the wider region. Also, the region wants to know if the Quad is going to cooperate on climate change. What in particular is it going to cooperate on? And again, one of my Southeast Asian connections said what they'd really like from the Quad in terms of climate change is a project that focuses on the Mekong Delta and the countries where the Mekong Delta runs, because that has been one of the areas most greatly affected by global warming. Next, if the Quad is really going to cooperate on critical and emerging technology, which critical and emerging technologies? The Quad was quite good with the detail around how it was going to deliver the COVID vaccines, but very light on detail in terms of climate change or critical and emerging technology. So Southeast Asian nations are wondering, does this mean the Quad is going to deliver a 5G network to rival China's potential 5G network? So, Quad stakeholders quite reasonably want to know what specifically is the Quad going to do. So just to touch very briefly on the more sensitive issue of the Quad framework and whether it's a strategic counterweight to China, the message I received in Canberra is that, many Southeast Asian nations don't want the Quad to make this situation worse. They want greater clarity around the Quad's motivations and whether it intends to confront China, and if so, how is it going to confront China? So in my view, as someone who's been in Canberra a long time and also still heavily connected to officials in defence, in my view, the Quad has no plans to organise its activities mainly in response to China or to increase its defence operations. Instead, the Quad really is focused on delivering regional goods. And so it's more like that quote that Benjamin Franklin had around, it's easier to win friends with honey than it is with vinegar. So the Quad has really recognised that instead of beefing up its military response, it's going to focus on delivering regional goods. But this also raises the question of, you know, if the Quad is still having to answer its partners and other countries in the region about what its purpose is, there's a real problem, a real image and branding problem for the Quad, and it needs to better explain its reason for being. So I think the Quad Leaders Summit, the next one that's coming up, provides a fantastic opportunity for the Quad to more explicitly outline its purpose, as well as provide some detail about its existing commitments. So just to summarise, what can Australia and the United States do to help bring the region along? Well, the paper that I've written for the Perth US Asia Centre makes two arguments. The first one is that the Quad needs to better communicate its purpose and intent. And the second is that it needs to deliver on its commitments. In relation to communication, what I heard from one senior Australian government official was that really at a basic level, the Quad needs a website, you know, a public presence that's similar to those of ASEAN or APEC, where, you know, to address the issue that Dr. Lee raised of a lot of inaccurate information out there about the Quad needs a public-facing platform so that it can really explain, set the record straight and explain what it's doing. And it could also include things like a list of all of its working groups, its joint statements, because at the moment, the Quad nations separately, while they have now announced joint statements, they're still publishing things individually through their national channels. And that really makes it look like it's a sort of still a disconnected grouping. Then in relation to number two, delivering on its commitments, what I think the Quad needs to do is actually consolidate its commitments and then prioritise them. So obviously the COVID-19 vaccine is the number one priority for the Quad. But after the vaccine, what next? What's its next priority? Because I can tell you, I highly doubt that this coalition government is going to do something with the Quad on climate change. I strongly believe that President Biden was enthusiastic to have climate change noted at the last Quad Leaders Summit, but there was no detail in it. And basically what the Quad said it would do on climate change was a restating of all the national positions of the Quad. So after that, you know, after COVID vaccines, what's the Quad going to do? Well, few people actually realize that the Quad has announced publicly at least 10 working groups. And that's a lot. It's a lot of different priorities to try and wrangle. So what I've suggested in my paper is that instead of having 10 working groups where the focus is scattered and it's not really communicating clearly what the Quad priorities really are, the Quad consolidate these into 3 pillars. The pillars that I think they should be are regional public goods, technology, and security. And each of the 10 working groups can come under those areas. So for example, under regional public goods, you would have the COVID vaccine, climate change action, quality infrastructure, and HADR. Under technology, you would have critical and emerging technology, supply chain resilience, and the cyber working groups. And finally, under security, you would have maritime security, counterterrorism, and countering disinformation. So within those 3 areas, I've just condensed all of the working groups. So I'll end up by saying this. I think it's really important for the Quad to explain better what it is and to tell us what its priorities are, because until the Quad does this, it will not have a very good chance of engaging ASEAN or Southeast Asian countries, because until then, Southeast Asian nations don't have the information they require to understand whether or not the Quad is worth their partnership. Thank you so much. And I really look forward to hearing from the other discussants.
Sharing with us Australia's position on the Quad, as well as providing information on the difficulties of the Quads maintaining public presence and communicating with the public. I guess some of these problems are faced by ASEAN as well, as some of us here would agree. And I look forward to questions to Ms. Chenna. So participants, if you have questions already, please don't hesitate to drop your question in the Q&A section, and please averse from using the chat function so I can navigate it easier. Thank you so much, Ms. Chenna. I would proceed now to Dr. Kei Koga from Japan. Dr. Kei, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And also I'd like to thank the Malaysia ISIS and then also the Australian High Commission in Malaysia for having me in this very interesting forum. So my task here is actually to provide some kind of Japan's long-term strategy in the Quad. And also I think we have the three kind of basic questions about this panel, the ASEAN and Southeast Asian kind of reaction to the Quad. And so let me kind of respond to I think I will touch on the Japan's long-term strategy after I focus on some of the questions I got to answer for this panel. So I think I have the three questions for this panel. The one is how has the different Southeast Asian stakeholders reacted to the Quad, and then probably like this is my kind of shortest response, but the bottom line is that the Southeast Asian responses are diverse, ranging from expressing expressing explicit concerns to providing the implicit support to maintaining the wait and see posture. So we can observe many different reactions to the Quad from the Southeast Asian countries. And then as we could see, actually there was a certain kind of skepticism about the Quad's institutional objective. For example, Singapore's Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan once said that Singapore would not join in the Quad if it aimed to counter China. And on the other hand, some countries are actually welcoming this initiative, and then there are several reasons. According to the Su's report on Quad, coming from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in 2018, many experts in Southeast Asia mentioned that the Quad was useful for maintaining the regional balance of power, or the symbolic kind of values of the US and the regional powers commitment, etc., etc. So I think these are the basic reactions, the diverse reactions we can observe. But to be sure, these reactions are based on each Southeast Asian state's own kind of speculations and expectations, because the institutional form of the Quad is still evolving and then not clearly consolidated. So I think that is the one thing I would kind of emphasize. I mean, like those are all the kind of speculations. We don't know the concrete kind of the form of the Quad at the endpoint yet. So that's the one thing. And the second thing is the member states. So usually the Quad is regarded as the kind of anti-China or counter-China the groupings. And then sometimes they are called as the kind of a securitized alliance or a security alliance. And then I guess it's kind of simple to answer, respond to this question, but it's really hard to kind of convince like everybody in Southeast Asia. And so the reason is because obviously on the one hand, obviously it is easy to deny the assumption or the statement that Quad is a securitized security alliance against China. First of all, Quad is not traditional security alliance among Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. The Japan, US, Australia security links are, of course, are very strong. And those three countries, the states have been nurturing the security ties with India as well. But their military linkage are not based on the treaty of the mutual defense. And second, the Quad members' national interests are not necessarily congruent with each other. although they share concerns about China's assertive behavior in the maritime domain and its challenges against the current international order to some extent, their approach toward China essentially differ, and which makes it difficult to bind them together like the Cold War alliance. And third, their military capabilities or power projection capabilities are not sufficient to defend member states' territory in the traditional sense. It is still inconceivable for India and Australia to dispatch their naval ships and the fighters to defend Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. Likewise, Japan and Australia does not have sufficient diplomatic will and the military assets to collectively defend India's border. So it is only the United States that has the global projection capabilities, but its commitment also fluctuates in each region. So overall, I think we could sufficiently argue that Quad is not primarily the security alliance against China. But that said, that it is also true that those 4 states have been trying to find a way to enhance the cooperation in non-traditional security areas, such as HADR, humanitarian assistance, the disaster relief, maritime security, critical and emerging technologies, and then the COVID-19 pandemics. And these issues are essentially transnational, so which requires the wider international cooperation. So this seemingly has little implications for traditional security issues. But then some of these issues have actually linked to counter China's economic and diplomatic influence, including digital and physical infrastructure in developing countries in Southeast Asia, and COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy to them as well. So this creates an image of securitized alliance against China. And then the problem is that even if the Quad attempts to negate such an image, like it's not like China or like the counter China coalition. So the initial image is hard to die. So to make the case that the Quad does not primarily aim to the counter China, probably like it is necessary to create a cooperative framework with China in the certain issue, such as I think the climate change is the kind of one of the issues we could focus on. So, and then the other thing, I think this is not necessarily only the Japan, but also I think the 4 countries in Quad face is the kind of how we gonna actually organize the regional architecture in the Pacific region. I think there are certain kind of skepticism, as I said, from the ASEAN member states, how the Quad is going to evolve in institutional form, and then what happened to the ASEAN centrality in the Pacific. So I think probably like easier way to get around is just focus on the non-traditional security issues. Again, like such as the HADR, and this would likely to be the key to lead ASEAN to engage with the Quad, and without disrupting its diplomatic stance of the non-alignment, or without disrupting the ASEAN centrality. But again, it would be also very difficult for ASEAN to openly and formally cooperate with the Quad because of the there are 3 other hurdles that they face. The firstly is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Southeast Asian member states have the different kind of perspective toward the Quads. So it's really hard to get them together. And then the ASEAN as an institution might not be willing to actually cooperate openly with the Quad as the regional institution. And then I think more importantly, secondly, even if ASEAN is able to reach a minimum level of consensus, it would be likely face a certain institutional dilemma in terms of the ASEAN centrality. So while the Quad always emphasize its respect for ASEAN centrality, if you look at the official documents or some other statement from the 4 countries about the ASEAN centrality, they all support it. But it is not clear how the Quad member states understand this ASEAN centrality. If it means only their respects for the existence of the ASEAN-led multilateral institutionalism in the region, and the Quad begins to play a leading role in pursuing the establishment of the so-called result-oriented institution in the Indo-Pacific, the ASEAN would unlikely accept the Quad because it might marginalize ASEAN as a regional institution diplomatically. And then these concerns might prevent ASEAN from explicitly engaging with the Quad. And thirdly, the ASEAN has its own issue, which derives from its again like strategic dilemma in the Pacific. On the one hand, ASEAN wants to maintain ASEAN centrality in order to ensure its institutional relevance in the Southeast Asia, East Asia, and also in the Pacific. The 2019 ASEAN outlook on in the Pacific, the so-called AOIP, has emphasized the ASEAN centrality, and this is necessary because it can prevent great powers from marginalizing the ASEAN diplomatically. But on the other hand, the ASEAN also does not specify what role ASEAN is willing to play in the Pacific. ASEAN does not discuss in the AOIP what institutional arrangement ASEAN can create in the region. This is partly because the geographical scope of Indo-Pacific is probably too broad for ASEAN to fully cover. So there are, I think, the more complicated institutional problems between ASEAN and the Quad, in addition to the non-alignment the issues, the principle that the ASEAN holds. And essentially to have an in-depth institutional cooperation between ASEAN and the Quad, both need to have their common understanding of the ASEAN centrality in the Pacific. So for now, I think the ASEAN would not directly.
Can you wrap up soon?
Sorry?
Can you wrap up soon?
Oh yeah, I will wrap up soon. Yeah, ASEAN
Okay,
would not directly engage with the Quad, and then instead each Southeast Asian states creates its own approach. As the Vietnam has already created the precedence by cooperating with the Quad plus states in countering COVID-19 in 2020. So I think like these are the things we could push forward, and then Japan is actually trying to strike the balance between this the ASEAN centrality and Quad resonator. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. K. Sorry for cutting you short on that. Dr. K actually presented problematizing some of the image problems that Quad has in trying to portray itself as a regional institutions, as well as this kind of like institutional dilemma from ASEAN side in trying to respond to Quad's projection. So without further ado, I would now pass the buck to my colleague, a new addition to ISIS Malaysia, Ms. Angeline Tan. Angeline, you have around 10 minutes to deliver your speech.
Thank you, Sinatra. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm very excited to be sharing my first speaking engagement with such an esteemed panel. I'm very humbled and honored today. And I thank the previous two speakers for their remarks earlier. I think a lot of my points are going to be echoing a lot of the things that they have already said, especially Ms. Haley. So talking about, following this morning's theme of the perception of the Quad, I think I want to echo Haley here that there is a lack of detail about what the Quad is and what they're trying to do in the region. So what my remarks want to focus on this morning is, to an extent, there is a trust deficit with the Quad, especially first with the Quad and Southeast Asian countries, but then more importantly with the Quad and China. And why I say that there's a trust deficit between Quad and Southeast Asia is, I think it's mainly first off centered around this issue of US engagement. The Quad's revival in recent months, it's closely tied to American leadership. So US foreign policy matters here. And to an extent, you can even see it as an extension of US foreign policy. And the fact is, the US, it hasn't always paid Southeast Asia the attention that it deserves. So for a start, the Biden administration, it has shown interest and it has shown some kind of initiative with Southeast Asia. The first indication of this is Secretary of State Blinken's attending of the ASEAN foreign ministers meeting. But that was an ASEAN foreign ministers meeting, and engaging with Southeast Asia is so much more than just ASEAN. We tend to assume when we talk about the Quad and ASEAN, we tend to assume that ASEAN is this regional entity with a unified voice, and it is true. But at the same time, ASEAN is also made up of member states that have a diverse range of interests and capabilities. So supporting ASEAN centrality is one thing, but if the Quad wants to really meaningfully and productively engage in this region, it's also important to engage in bilateral diplomacy. So looking back with the US again, since Biden took office, I think there has been increased engagement. In recent months, his Deputy Secretary of State, his Defense Secretary, even the Vice President, they've all made visits across Southeast Asia. There is a noticeable increase in engagement here, but they have only covered 6 out of 10 of the ASEAN countries. Malaysia is one of the 4 that was left out. High-level engagement with Biden's administration is noticeably absent, not just lacking. And this clearly demonstrates, it tells me at least, that Malaysia is at the bottom of the US's list of strategic allies in the region. It's not very convincing for us to trust the US to play an increased role in the region, regardless of whether it's unilaterally or through the Quad. And of course, Malaysia wants to see closer ties with the US and with the Quad as a coherent entity, especially so that we can pursue a more balanced foreign policy on issues that we have trouble with, such as the South China Sea. Now, if you try to contrast this relationship of neglect with the US, Malaysia has a thriving relationship with China. They are our top trading partner. High-level exchanges with China throughout the pandemic have been frequent and consistent. But regardless of how strong our relationship is with China, it doesn't mean that we lean closer towards Beijing. It doesn't mean that we have less of an interest in a relationship with the US or the Quad. Malaysia wants to have a diverse set of allies, but we also want allies that value us as strategic partners. And the Quad has yet to demonstrate that Malaysia is an important strategic ally, or even convince us that their presence and their involvement in the region has any benefits to us. They haven't really been engaging with us. And then speaking more on a regional level about this trust deficit, this skepticism, if you will, looking at examples like Cambodia and Thailand, they may not be as keen on a Quad presence as well, especially if it's going to be based on strategic considerations. So for example, while Thailand would want to have closer economic and diplomatic relations with, for example, Washington, they don't want to get embroiled into the existing US-China rivalries. They don't want to be pulled into issues like the South China Sea, which is really not Thailand's primary concerns. And similarly, there isn't really a strong incentive for Cambodia to seek closer relations with the US if that means it's going to undermine their relationship with Beijing. So the Quad, they've been claiming that they're not here to make us pick sides. They try to make it very clear that they are an option in the region. But at the same time, we also have to be very mindful that China is very deeply interconnected with the region. And China has established itself as not only a reliable, but a very important economic partner. So how does the Quad compete with that reputation, with that kind of established role? It needs to be able to try to convince Southeast Asia, not just ASEAN, but the region as a whole, that the Quad is a viable, relevant, attractive option. It's not just, they can't just say that we are an option, they need to make themselves available. So really, I think the Quad needs to work on gaining trust in Southeast Asia. They need to engage better. And they can do so by, I'm going to echo what Haley said again, they need to set clear goals, clear objectives that are specific to Southeast Asia. The Quad has announced their multiple working groups and the kinds of issues that they want to touch on. But these are just ideas. There's nothing specific and actionable to Southeast Asia. They need to communicate better. They need to learn to present themselves better. Because otherwise, why should ASEAN countries be convinced to take the Quad seriously and see them as a relevant and attractive option? So moving on to this second issue about skepticism with China. So I'm going to be focusing on China's perception here. And this is important because it also consequently has an effect on how Southeast Asia manages its the existing dynamics at play. So another one of the Quad's claims that we've also kind of been talking about is that they are not an anti-China alliance, they're not a security alliance, which is great, that's the claim. But can it convince and assure China that it isn't? If we look at it from China's perspective, they are very sensitive to the Quad, especially if the slogan is the so-called free and Indo-Pacific. They feel like, China feels as if the fingers are being pointed at them. They feel as if China is being called out as unfree and unopen. And then on top of that, it's also very sensitive that this Quad, the members are made up of, for a lack of a better word, adversaries of China. It feels ganged up on left and right with India and Japan, near and far in Australia and the US. So if the Quad really wants to prove that it is not an anti-China coalition, then very simply, it needs to be able to demonstrate that it can, but more importantly, it wants to cooperate with China. And there are plenty of areas of cooperation. And a prime example of that, a very hot topic right now, is vaccine diplomacy. Vaccine diplomacy, though, unfortunately, right now is getting tangled up into existing rivalries, and it's become a competition. And an example of that is that the very petty race to announce vaccine donations during Vice President Harris's trip to Hanoi. So if the Quad is sincere about helping the region, about delivering and providing regional goods, then by all means, help. But try at best to avoid intensifying the competition. And it can do so very, very simply by working alongside Beijing. It needs to engage with China better, and it needs to build this trust with China that they're not there to antagonize or limit China's ability to grow, because that's really China's main concern. And cooperation, it doesn't have to be limited to the mechanisms of the Quad as well. Quad members, they are members of other institutions, and they can utilize these other tools and institutions to build trust with China. So for example, India can become more active in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And similarly, Japan can work better with China through the ASEAN +3 mechanism. There are definitely avenues outside of the Quad to build trust as well, so that China doesn't feel ganged up on. So what I'm really trying to say is it's not enough for the Quad to just say they're not interested in a zero-sum competition, because talk is so easy to just say, because what they end up doing is a lot of their actions end up playing into the rivalries that, you know, are getting intensified as the days, months go by. What the Quad really needs to do is act in a way that both regional allies within Southeast Asia, but also China, can trust them and trust that the Quad's participation in the region is valuable. Yeah, but I also want to be clear that when I keep saying this lack of trust, I don't mean that the region is skeptical and would prefer the Quad not to get involved. But I'm saying, again, you know, there needs to be clear communication, but also there needs to be better and quality engagement from the Quad with all the stakeholders at play. And it definitely needs better relationships with China, regardless of whether it's a US relationship or a Quad-China relationship. And if the Quad, to just wrap up my remarks, if they're able to build trust and prove that they can be cooperative, especially with China, then it will naturally gain wider support in ASEAN, because everybody wants to see a situation where everyone can get along, but everyone can also reap the benefits. So that's really all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Angeline, for sticking to the time limit. Angeline spoke at length about a very frank opinion on Quad's relationship with Southeast Asia, but also providing some steps that the Quad can take to reduce this assumption that China is being ganged up and whatnot by the Quad member states. So I would like to see if Prof. Dewi would agree with some of the assessments from our fellow Southeast Asian scholar here, Angeline Tan. So Prof. Dewi, I think I will pass the buck to you now. Your 10 minutes starts now.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed all the presentations and I agree with all of them, but I'm going to be much more provocative and you know, and be frank, call a spade, okay? Since I'm not in the government now, so I'm free to say whatever I want. Firstly, what Haley's talk about the shadow history, I think it's very important, and I don't think you can go to the forward without understanding where the Quad come from and why it stopped working between 2008 and 2017. And I think that was very, very clear We don't forget that the Quad met on the sideline of an ASEAN-led meeting in Manila. It was an informal caucus between these 4 countries. And at the time, nobody really paid much attention to it. But Kevin Rudd felt it necessary to say that, we do not want to continue with the Quad because it may be seen to be anti-China. So the timing of the revival of the Quad in 2017, at the height of the US-China trade war, at the height of anger, the Australia, which is very close to China, felt very disturbed by a lot of the Chinese engagements, interference in some domestic politics in Australia, and then the India-China altercations, the border conflict, and the perceptions that China is muscling into India's sphere of influence in the Indian Ocean. And of course, with Japan, as the dynamic is always very clear there. The East China Sea and so on. So I don't think that we should pretend why the revival took place in 2017. Within the context of the strategic rivalry between the US and China, the Quad is and should be seen as a new strategic alignment, not an alliance, because the 3 countries are already military allies, treaty allies of the US, but India is a non-aligned country. So it cannot, of course, it cannot be a military alliance. But I don't think that you need to be apologetic about the context of the Quad, the timing. It's not convincing. I mean, you can talk from both sides of your mouth. We are not convinced. The Quad is part of the strategic rivalry with China, adopted by 4 countries. 3 countries are already treaty allies of the US and all have problems with China. And the other one is a non-aligned country, which in the past did not have that close relations with the United States. But now India's strategic outlook is very different because of its concern with China. So I'm going to begin my remark. It's not perception, reception, opportunities, perception. The perception, no matter how many sides of your mouth you're going to talk, from Southeast Asia, from my perception, the Quad is part of the strategic rivalry. Some may say that it is a strategy to contain China. Others would argue it is not a strategy to contain China, it is a strategy to constrain China. And I said, why do you need to apologize about that? If you're talking about rivalry, we are talking about strategic competitions. Why do you need to apologize that the Quad is not that? And why not just come out honestly, that this is a strategy to constrain China? I agree with Angelina that, the Quad should not be seen as a strategy to stop China from growing. But Indonesia as a non-aligned country and as an ASEAN, as a non-aligned organization that doesn't want to take side, doesn't mean that we are totally neutral and passive. ASEAN countries all support China's growth. We all support very close relations with China. For economic pragmatism, all ASEAN countries have very close relations with China. Indonesia, which from 1968 to 1990 froze relations, diplomatic relations with China, now has very close economic relations with China. China is the largest trading partner now and the second largest foreign direct investor. But at the same time, almost all of the ASEAN countries also have problems with China. So all of the ASEAN countries carry out what you might call hedging plus policy, return maximizing with China with a little bit of a lot of economic pragmatism, a little bit of bandwagoning. But at the same time, I think most of the ASEAN countries, including Vietnam, that was an enemy of the United States, is also carrying a bit of balancing against China. So while the Quad should not be intended to limit China's growth as an economic superpower, I certainly hope that the Quad is worth of its salt and can act as a constraint against China's hegemonic ambition. If you're not going to be able to do that, what's the point? And that's so the perception is that it is seen as part of the strategic rivalry. It is seen as still, I think it's more than a caucus, but it's not an alliance. But that it should be seen as a credible effort to provide Southeast Asia with choices. So I take a slightly different take here, and then come to reception. Indonesia is a non-aligned country, and we are used to navigate between a rocks and a hard place all the time. And the most important thing for a non-aligned country is competition is useful because it increases the values, because the countries that are competing with each other will try to court, ASEAN countries, will try to come up with offers, whether at the individual level or whether as collectivity, to improve capacity of the ASEAN countries, for example, that is to come up with offers of economic opportunities, to come up with offers with building up capacities, particularly in the maritime area and so on. But at the same time, ASEAN countries, and Indonesia particularly, will not want to be allied with multilateral institutions like the Quad, because even within ASEAN, we do not have multilateral security cooperation when it comes to collective defense. Within ASEAN, the preference has always been at a bilateral level. Indonesia only has one security agreement, that is with Australia. Indonesia doesn't even have a security agreement with any other of the ASEAN countries, and the preference within ASEAN has always been bilateral or minilateral. So in this case, the perceptions toward Quad is that from the Indonesian side is just neutral. It is neither against, nor very supportive of it, but it sees that it has a role. So within an ASEAN multilateral context, minilateralism, bilateralism, and minilateralism have always had a role to play. So in that respect, I would say that this is, can probably say my personal view, the reception towards the Quad is just neutral. It can be useful, it can provide additional values. What would be the opportunities for all of the ASEAN countries, and including Indonesia, has very good relations with every single Quad countries. Comprehensive strategic partnership with the United States, comprehensive strategic partnership with Australia, with Japan, and also with India. With ASEAN, all the ASEAN countries have dialogue relationships with all of the Quad countries. Now we are talking about institutions. What will be the role of the Quad and the role of ASEAN? So I'm try to look at it. The Quad clearly needs to explain itself more. But as I say, don't try to pretend what you're not, but also don't try to promise what you cannot deliver. But the question is about ASEAN centrality. Kay talk about the concerns. Clearly, there is concerns about ASEAN centrality. But if I look at it, if the Quad is taking over the multilateral institutions, becoming Quad-centric, then it will be a problem for ASEAN. But if the Quad focuses on the minilateral activities, which are more focused on deliverables, which is more exclusive in nature, but then can work with their individual ASEAN countries, then it has a role to play, while ASEAN is in the business of convening. ASEAN is a regional convener. The criticism against ASEAN is precisely its strength. ASEAN is a talk shop. ASEAN does not have the capacity to deliver real goods, including the real security goods. What ASEAN does, and which nobody else can replace, is that ASEAN is accepted by everyone. ASEAN is not suspected of trying to exclude anybody, and the stress on ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific is that it is open, it is transparent, inclusive, but at the same time it's ASEAN-centric, using existing ASEAN mechanisms. So does it compete with the Quad? I don't think so, because they're in the different business. Because ASEAN, as I say, brings all of the Quad members together where they can sit down with China. But when it tries to deliver vaccine, for example, ASEAN itself cannot do that for ASEAN members. So we all welcome that. So in that sense, I'm much more I'm not agnostic, yeah, but not negative either. And if there are concerns that if the Quad becomes a hard security alliance, which I don't think it can never have unless India changes its DNA, if it becomes a real hard security alliance and then carry out open confrontations against China, that would be very problematic for us. If we are pushed into a situation where Southeast Asia will have to choose between other side, that would be problematic for us, and we do not want to go in that direction. And that is why ASEAN insists on this inclusive regional architecture where everybody comes in. But if there is competition, and the competition is already there, and that is something that, what ASEAN can do, that is an opportunity. ASEAN and individual ASEAN members can and do act as a bridge between the Quad countries and China. But at the same time, as I said, the competition also provide opportunities. Our values increase because all the different sides try to engage with ASEAN member states and also with ASEAN countries. And finally, about reassuring China, that Quad is not trying to constrain China. Why? Why do you need to reassure China that the Quad is not trying to constrain China? But at the same time, you also need to ensure that where, as Biden himself said in his foreign policy article, we'll compete with China where we need to, but we'll cooperate with China where we can. And there are so many non-traditional security issues where cooperation is necessary. So I don't see cooperation and competition as something totally mutually exclusive here. And for Southeast Asia, if we can play the game of non-alignment and hedging plus, hedging means return maximizing and risk contingency in which the Quad has a play. At the same time, the plus is that we play our middle power role of becoming a bridge, becoming a convener. Then I think we can benefit from all the different choices. I think I should stop here.
Thank you, Prof. Dewi. I think I have to say that the rooster in your background agreed with some of the points when you deliver your presentation, because the rooster crows when you hit some very interesting points. Thank you so much for your valuable insights. So 4 presenters, 4 different viewpoints. Obviously, there are some alignments and there are some debates throughout in the past 40 minutes, and we'll now head into the Q&A section. We have at least 14 minutes to tackle this session. I can already see that the Q&A section exploded with many long questions here. So I guess we'll start one by one. And this first question is from Dr. Munira Alatas. It's about perception and how diplomacy and threat perception influence state response, strategic vocabulary, and ultimately the perception of containment. She'd like the speaker to address this this sort of comment about Quad's perception of as a containing force against China. But this is definitely something to do with again what Ms. Haley Chana said earlier about Quad's public perception and its capability to maintain a positive image among the public. So who would want to start with this question? Prof. Dewi, Dr. K. Koga?
Well, I think I think in defense of Quad, it will be the Quad member countries. We don't need to defend the Quad.
Yeah.
So
all right.
Okay.
Maybe we will have Dr. K to answer this first question first. Then we'll head on to others.
All right. So I think basically I agree with what Professor Dewi actually mentioned in her speech, and then that is, I think the Quad itself was actually originated from the threat perception toward China, right? I mean, China has actually increasingly been assertive in terms of the maritime security, and also the challenging against the international standards that the so-called the Western countries set in the past. So I think the Quad was originally coming from that, but then it does not necessarily mean the Quad countries or Quad member actually try to contain the China. And I think what China actually is trying to, what the Quad member actually trying to do is to maintain kind of rules-based order that is has every country, the regional countries could actually follow the certain same rule and then the same kind of norms set in the Pacific. So there's a kind of I think like the differences between the what the Quad actually wants to do in terms of the international maintaining or like the strengthening or creating international order in the Pacific, and also like what they actually perceive China in terms of the international security. So I don't know, like if I actually answer the correct, succinctly, but the containment is not actually the term the Quad member states actually use. So it's just kind of perception coming from it. I don't know to what extent it could mitigate the perception from China toward the Quad, but that's actually the emphasis the Quad member states always do. So.
Thank you so much.
If I can jump right here,
by all means, please.
Sinatra. I mean, I think different Quad countries say different things. Australia is clearly softer, and Japan is very soft with China, because both Japan and Australia, like Indonesia, Japan, despite the alliance with the United States, and Australia are still hedging, with China, because the economic interests are very closely linked, and so you're carrying hedging, both this return maximizing and risk contingency. But when Mike Pompeo talked about, how he saw the U.S. policy of China, and I think it was mentioned earlier by Haley, I think that the U.S. policy here matters, and whose voice is most heard. I think at one point the word containment did come into it. Although this is not the first forum where I talk about the Quad. Some Quad member officials talk, we are not containing, we are trying to constrain. And I said, then why not? I think the whole point of the ASEAN multilateralism is about constraining great powers. It's not about China. We try to constrain, the East Asia Summit, Martina Talagawa, the former Indonesian Prime Minister, the way we insisted on opening the East Asia Summit, bringing in India, bringing in Australia and New Zealand, is precisely to create a dynamic equilibrium, balancing within a cooperative framework, not balancing within a competitive, too much of a, so it's not like a collective security, but it's more cooperative security. And it's about constraining powers. Who happens to be the hegemon at the moment? It could be if Japan, becomes again the #1 economy in the world and develops a more militaristic policy, it will be constraining Japan. So if the US again behaves in a manner that is irresponsible to global governance, not respecting international law, our institutions will be wanting to constrain that kind of exercise of power either. So it's not simply be seen as constraining China, but for the Quad countries, all four of the Quad countries do have current problems, existing problems, which are not, and I think that historical context, the time cannot be ignored. But I would say, not containing because the situation is very different from the Cold War. But it is still, there is now greater competition. But at this time, cooperation is possible, not just because of the interdependence in our economic system, but also the nature of the non-traditional security threats that we have, where this has to be transnational in nature, where we need to approach climate change or pandemic and even maritime issues in a more cooperative manner, not in a zero-sum manner. But as I say, I'm just telling to you Quad friends there, if you apologize too much, you become meaningless. So why, so why not be more honest in a way what you're doing and what you're not doing? If you become if you try to confuse, to play in shadow, you might become too shadowy, and for us, it only makes us much more confused.
The combined additional info from Dr. K and Prof. Devi answered some of the questions in the Q&A box already. I'm just curious if Ms. Haley Chana has anything to respond to some of these points raised by Dr. K and Prof. Devi as well.
Thank you. I mean, there's actually so many thoughts going through my head about all the different presentations. I mean, one of the main reflections that I have is that, yes, the Quad countries have done a lot of things wrong and allowed this ambiguity around what the group is to continue. But I also think the group is very hamstrung by a lot of things. Like many people think that the Quad can be all things to all people, that because the 4 countries all have bad relations with China at the moment, and because they were initially started as a maritime grouping, and because Australia is now re-included in Malabar, that the best the Quad can hope to achieve and what it's really going for is to counter Chinese influence through force. And I fully accept all the criticisms of the Quad. They've done some things to really not help themselves very well. But I don't think it would work in favor of the Quad for it to be explicit and say, yes, we all have bad relations with China and we're trying to propose other alternatives to compete with China. I just don't see countries in the region responding positively to that, because it would make them harder to engage with the Quad, because the Quad would be explicitly saying it is providing alternatives explicitly to Chinese models. And it kind of limits the Quad, you know. I mean, the truth is the Quad has come back together because all 4 countries are concerned about aggressive Chinese actions. But the best way to approach that, to be able to counter that, is by providing attractive alternatives. And the main problem the Quad has had is that only recently it's said it's actually going to do activities, not just dialogue. And so it has a small track record. And I don't think that they would be an effective counter to China in many ways, because the 4 countries have different views on China. They have similar views, but they have different ways of approaching China. And so the best that they can do is provide attractive alternatives in infrastructure, working with the region on supply chains. I think HADR was mentioned before, and also providing critical technology. But also the problem is providing all of these regional goods is really expensive. And China is doing some of it with its Belt and Road Initiative, but it also can't afford to do everything and has been pulling back on its Belt and Road Initiative. So I just think, you know, the Quad cannot be everything to everyone unless all of the countries poured money into it, which they're not going to do. So I just think we need to kind of bring it back a little bit and think, okay, it's not, you know, the solution to all of the region's problems. It is an early, you know, action group that needs to do a couple of things well, and it can't do everything.
Thank you, Ms. China, for that. We only have 4 minutes left, so I'll tackle one more question. Angeline, don't worry, this question is for you, though I'll hope others can respond to quickly, very quickly. And after this question, I will invite all speakers to deliver their half-a-minute closing remark. All right, so the question to Angeline and others, if they want to follow up, is from Haris Zainul. Is there a general baseline Southeast Asian reaction to the Quad, or are there meaningful differences between them? I think this ties back to what Dr. Keikogas mentioned earlier about the difficulties to convince everyone in Southeast Asia about the values and objectives of the Quad. So Angeline, do you have any response to that?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite difficult to speak for all of Southeast Asia as a whole, but I think the general baseline for Southeast Asia, it's pretty much guided by ASEAN and this ASEAN way. And in my perspective, I think everybody's more cautious. So they're waiting to see what the Quad is, what they're trying to do and what they're saying before they're making their stance on it. And I think it also depends on the kind of engagement that the Quad members have with these individual Southeast Asian countries. So for example, it's very clear that Vietnam and Singapore, they have become the US favorites in the region. They've had much higher level engagements with the Biden administration. But despite them having this kind of favoritism, you also don't really see them trying to align closer with the US, and you see them probably going towards the direction of using this closer relation with the US, but also with the Quad, to have a more balanced hedging policy. So I think at the moment, it's really just kind of wait and see what the Quad presents itself before the countries in the region decide.
Any of the speakers would like to add on? Prof. Dewi, I see you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I lost the connection very briefly. I think, first on the existence of the Quad itself, I say, we are agnostic, non-aligned about it. It's their business. All countries have a right to do, and hopefully that there is a value to it. But dealing with the Quad countries individually, this is something that all ASEAN countries do. But ASEAN as an institution dealing with the Quad, an institution, I'm not sure yet. Yeah. Because we are not, it is not an organization with a secretariat and so on. So this is not like IORA, where ASEAN plans to, to have dealing with the IORA, for example, where all of the Quad countries are also a member of the IORA. Will we individual ASEAN countries, like Indonesia, for example, join the Quad? In fact, I asked this of one of our high-ranking military officers, if the Quad countries organize, join the military exercises, and it invites ASEAN, will it do it? Given the fact that Indonesia has joint exercise with Australia, with the United States, also increasingly, also with Japan and also with India. But if it comes at the multilateral level, will Indonesia join? I think that's going to be a problem, because people say, how does it, adhere to our free and active foreign policy? Would it be seen as, being part of a new sort of alignment? So I think there's going to be debate in Jakarta. Some, the more pragmatic, security-oriented one, maybe say, yes, we should do it. But others who are more purist about free and active foreign policy and non-alignment say, maybe not. In my case, maybe at the think tank level, we've already done it. So the Quad Plus at the track 2 level, I personally have already taken part in that. The Habibie Center has taken part in that. But at the official level, the track 1, I doubt it for the time being.
Thank you for the frank view on that, Prof. Dewi. We're reaching the end of our session this morning, so I'll invite all of the speakers to deliver their half-a-minute closing remark. We will start with Ms. Chana.
Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed this session very much. To close, I would just say that if Southeast Asian nations are considering working with Quad countries, I would never call it Quad Plus. That's just multilateralism. And if you call it Quad Plus, there's a lot of politics involved, and it kind of relegates the plus country to an add-on, not an equal partner. So I think once you've got any more than 4, it's no longer a Quad.
I'll pass to Dr. Keiko now.
All right. Thank you very much. I also enjoyed the discussion here today. I just would like to kind of mention that the Quad, I think the Quad is still evolving, and we don't actually have any kind of like particular the objective, like clearly have the consensus among the 4 member states. So what we could actually do is Southeast Asian countries, I wish Southeast Asian countries could actually raise a voice and what actually they expect from the Quad. And then the Quad countries actually understand what their demands from the Southeast Asia. And then they're gonna actually incorporate this kind of demand and then try to actually modify. So I think that's the interactive, interaction is a really important way to actually evolve the Quad further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Keiko. Thank you so much. Angeline.
Right. So my closing remarks, kind of building on what I was already talking about, the trust deficit, is apart from another part of their PR issue is not just their communication with regional allies, but also their coordination within the Quad itself. So I think Dr. K was saying earlier that all of the members, they have different approaches to China. And this is very confusing, especially since there's this, this thing going around saying that it is an anti-China alliance. So I think that it's not just confusing to me, I'm sure it's confusing to all of the Southeast Asian countries as well. So if there's better coordination on this part, I'm sure they would have a much better reception.
Thank you so much. Prof. Dewi. Yes, Prof. Dewi.
Yeah, okay. Well, I stand by my point that, I see the Quad as part of the great power strategic rivalry. That the Quad is part of an effort to constrain China, but I see it that between ASEAN multilateralism and the Quad minilateralism, they do not need to be confrontational or sidelining each other. I see that centrality of ASEAN has an important role to play, and I see that the Quad can also add value.
Thank you so much, Prof. Dewi, and all of our speakers, as well as participants in this morning's session 1. I hope you've all been managed to grab the key takeaways from this morning session, and maybe a note to organizer. This has been a very good engagement. So probably it's something to consider. Maybe we want to highlight the Quad. This Quad session in the APR next year. So maybe just a note to the organizer. Yeah. Thank you so much again to the speaker. We hope to invite you again in our future events by ASEANs Malaysia. I'll pass the space back to Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sinatra, and thank you to all the speakers of the first panel. Folks, we are going to go on a 6-minute break. It's 10:54 in KL, and we will be back at 11 o'clock for the second session, which is our last session. So see all of you in 6 to 5 minutes. Have a good break. Okay, let's get the second session on the road. And I do apologize for the massive sound of construction coming from my neighbor's unit. They always seem to know when I have to either speak or run or manage a panel. So they get their workers on crack or something, and everything picks up when I have to do this. But we are here for the second and last session of the forum. Now, this focuses on opportunities for the Quad beyond the strategic security aspects, and some of the questions that we hope to address include the leverage of whether the Quad can leverage on existing initiatives like the Blue Dot Network to tap into a strong regional desire for investment, or whether existing Quad working groups focused on vaccines, climate change, or emerging tech can really leverage on the critical needs of this region. We have 4 speakers, and I will introduce them in turn briefly before I ask them to speak. And we will do it in turn. And I will be co-moderating this session with my colleague, Iza. Our first speaker is Brad Goserman. Now, Brad is a full-time troublemaker, full stop. In his spare time, he is the Deputy Director and Visiting Professor at the Center for Rulemaking Strategies at Tama University. He is also a non-resident senior advisor at Pacific Forum in Honolulu, where he had served for 13 years, and a contributing editor with the Japan Times. With that introduction, Brad, I turn it over to you. You have 10 minutes, sir.
Thanks, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers, the sponsors, everyone. It's a delight. It's a great topic. It's important. It's a timely meeting. This does not compensate for a trip to KL for the APR. I'm still waiting for that. I think the evolution of the Quad is really vital. And I will take issue with the title of this session because I think that the things that we're talking about are extremely strategic. They may not be security strictly oriented or strictly described, but nevertheless, they are exceptionally strategic and need to be considered as such. And let me offer then, in the interest of my reputation and in time, to offer you sort of ways to think about the Quad. These are the issues that the questions that came to mind, are the things that struck me as deserving of more consideration. And they'll be probably short and incomplete, and nevertheless will need to have some explication in the Q&A or discussion or taken up by other participants. But so I apologize in advance for being a little perhaps shorter than offering a full understanding of these ideas. First, I would begin with the fact again that this is strategic. And the 21st century great power competition, which I believe is an accurate assessment of the way the world is going to be and is working, is as much non-military, meaning political, economic, and ideological, as it is military. It's not to say that the military dimension isn't important, but I think we need to be giving equal, if not greater, significance to these other dimensions. And I think that sort of distinguishes it in many ways from this moment, from the great power competition of the Cold War. But I think we don't really quite appreciate that. Our inclination is to say military is strategic and the rest of this is kind of lagniappe, it's extra. It's something else that we need to be thinking about. And I think that's wrong. Central to this, to this notion of technology or his notion of economic and diplomatic engagement is the role of technology. And that will figure, of course, in the 3 working groups that we'll be discussing later and has already come up in the previous conversation. What will matter ultimately, I believe, is the ability, again, as the previous speakers underscored or implied at least, is the need that the Quad to make concrete improvements in the lives of the people of the region and of the world that it hopes to affect. And to the degree that it does that, then the Quad is important, it will be a success. And the rest of this other stuff that we talk about really is kind of immaterial if in fact we do make a difference in the lives of millions and billions of people and thus shape their perceptions both of these institutions and the organizations and the governments that work within them. I've always thought, to be dismissive and rude, that the idea of an Asian NATO is always rather silly. It is too heavy a lift in general. I think we all know about the difficulties attached to security institutions in this region. The idea that somehow the Quad was going to be a precursor to this larger structured security architecture was just kind of nonsense and an easy and lazy way to think about it, and absolutely a cultural, a geographical, a historical, a everything. If nothing else, apart from the larger set of issues, there's just the fact, as again the speakers identified previously, that there are structural asymmetries to so much of this. India is not, unlike the other members of the Quad, an ally and alliance partner, and thus there is a fundamental problem with creating a larger military structure beyond some loosey-goosey arrangements that I think we've already seen and really aren't the subject of this particular session. Let me offer you sort of 3 major points. The first will be a US perspective, or the issues that I want to just highlight and perhaps discuss. The second will be a Japanese perspective, because I live in Tokyo and I'm supposed to be something of a Japan specialist, as well as it figures prominently in this conversation. And then finally, just the notion of expanding the Quad, reflecting the conversation I had earlier this morning, as well as what I heard in the previous section. For the United States, I think we need to look at the Quad as part of what appears to be an emerging sort of 3-pronged template for the way that we're going to be thinking about problems of the world, right? And this notion of President Biden administration to bring the United States back, the way that we're thinking about our role in the world, whether it's the meeting with the summit with Prime Minister Suga, President Moon, in the G7 meeting, or in the Quad, is 3 pieces. It is a study group on climate, it is a study group on health, and it is a study group on technology. And it seems to be those are the 3 baskets with which we're speaking and addressing most of the problems, with all due respect to Haley's 10 different working groups. I think those are the big ones and that have the potential to make the biggest difference, and the ones that we keep seeing in all of these different forms of American engagement. And I think the repetition here suggests, it gives us important insight into the way the United States is thinking about the key problems and the ways to engage other countries to deal with them. Second, I think, as again was noted previously, there is an inherent, or certainly a perceived, tension in the United States between dealing with the Quad and dealing with ASEAN. And I think a lot of people anticipated that ASEAN was, at the beginning of the administration, that ASEAN would get much more of the attention, certainly given the way that the administration had spoken. But I think there has been problems with ASEAN engagement, Southeast Asia as well. But a lot of this has just been a product of really, really poor circumstances. And it has to do with the COVID canceling, for example, Secretary of Defense Austin's trip to Singapore earlier this summer, that just threw a wrench in plans, the technology issues that prevented Secretary Blinken from talking to his counterparts, the coup in Myanmar, which really complicated engagement with both that country and with ASEAN more generally, ongoing issues in the region that have just been, if you will, circumstances that have impeded engagement with Southeast Asia, and you've seen a commensurate move forward with the Quad. And so I think that's highlighted a tension that perhaps many people didn't anticipate, and quite frankly, I think will recede as time passes. The second tension, which I think is more fundamental, and one that the United States is going to have a hard time overcoming, is the tension between the Build Back Better program, which is the foundation of building a consensus in the United States for greater engagement. This notion that President Biden and his National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, talked about, of a domestically oriented foreign policy that rebuilt a national consensus behind engagement, that there is a foundational tension here between ultimately spending money in the United States and spending money in the rest of the world. And that's what so much of the key track for the Quad and for this great power competition that I mentioned is engagement in ways that better the lives of people, whether we're talking about infrastructure, whether we're talking about vaccines or trade or what have you. It's not the crude American first protectionism of the Trump era, but it is certainly a reassertion of American priority in ways that will make it look as though the United States is retreating and withdrawing. That is not necessarily the case, but that is certainly the way it can and oftentimes will be perceived. And so the United States is going to have to work very hard to make sure that it can both rebuild and direct its energies inward and deal with the foreign policy questions that require it to be engaged elsewhere. Related to this, as the final point of the United States, will be the question of American commitment. And the United States talks, and President Biden has talked a great deal about understanding its role in the world, et cetera. And we've seen this. In the aftermath, however, of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think there are questions that are being raised, and it's easy to distinguish them. It is easy to put them aside, but I think doubts are present. And thus, while the intent, which I approve, is to refocus American energies on critical foreign policy challenges and to avoid the distractions of, truthfully, which are sideshows like Afghanistan, the degree to which the United States can then actually deliver on that promise is going to really be critical in the way that it is perceived and the future of institutions or organizations or fora like the Quad, which are intended to deliver on that promise of focus and really driving, if you will, the competition for the 21st century. Second, let me turn quickly to Japan. I would note that the Quad plays to Japanese strengths with this focus on these other dimensions, which would be investments, economic engagement, getting away from values, getting away from hard military questions. All these plays to Japanese strengths. Second, consistent with that, Japan seems to be set up to do the heavy economic lifting of engagement, which again fits given the constraints on the United States that it's going to be facing, as well as just the limits that Australia and India have when it comes to putting money on the table. And then finally, given the churn in Japanese domestic politics right now, there are some doubts about how far Japan will go. But I think the general course of Japanese foreign policy and engagement is set. And so you'll see some shift on the margins, but not necessarily in terms of the major thrust of the Quad and certainly Japanese foreign policy more generally, and the Quad as an expression of that. Finally, expanding the Quad. And given the previous conversation, I think that it's really important that words matter. And I think we're wrong to say we talk about other countries joining the Quad. I think what we should be talking about is other countries participating in Quad activities. And that's an important distinction. It's the opportunity to return, if you will, to coalitions of the willing that George W. Bush used to talk about, where we bring together coalitions of the like-minded to solve problems. And if we do that, again, if we make a difference in the lives of people, the region, then the Quad has a chance to make a really, really important contribution and to matter, and therefore to, I think, acquire legs and momentum and be seen as more significant. Finally, my last point is related to that. If we're looking with engagement, and in this particular area, I think this more than anything else is where Europe can truly play a role in the region, and we can talk about that, but I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much, Brad. That was certainly quite a few points there to chew on, and I hope that we can come back to that during the discussion. Folks, if you have any questions or comments, please do put them into the Q&A function. We do encourage a robust discussion and feedback from you. Our next speaker is Yanita Mina Lewis. Mina is a researcher with ISIS Malaysia. Her research interests include political psychology, comparative regionalism, focusing on South Asian and Southeast Asian studies, as well as domestic affairs like social welfare and gender-responsive policymaking. Mina is currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Malaya, where her dissertation is focused on non-Western international relations. Mina, I think you have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I really appreciate being here today to be able to share my thoughts. Thank you, Dr. Brad, for setting the tone to this discussion. Today, my remarks will focus on India's role in the Quad beyond strategic security and also implications for Southeast Asia. We've heard a lot about the ASEAN perspective to the Quad, and I'll be trying to just address a bit of this right here. So my main argument today is that India could be the Quad's gateway to Southeast Asia. I guess right about now, this discourse is not very popular in Southeast Asia, so I'll be trying to talk a bit about that. Diving away, straight away, my first point is basically that India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, or the IPOI, underscores the importance of ASEAN centrality, as we know, and it also addresses pressing challenges common to India and Southeast Asia. In April 2019, India set up an Indo-Pacific wing, and under that came ASEAN, the Quad, and also IORA. So it was very indicative that India's approach to these three mechanisms would be alike, with ASEAN in the center. And so the IPOI was launched a few months later in November 2019 as an open global initiative with a focus on 7 main pillars, which also focused mainly on infrastructure, maritime connectivity, cooperation, capacity building, knowledge, and information sharing as well. And the focus on infrastructure here, if we see clearly, was it underlined the importance of disaster resilient infrastructure, which aligns with the CDRI, or the Coalition of Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, that was mooted by Prime Minister Modi a couple of years ago, and also port infrastructure. So we see how important this shift was for the IPOI. And as we know, the IPOI is built on the India's Act East policy, which is based on the 4 Cs, as we know, culture, commerce, connectivity, and also capacity building. And it is interesting to note that right about now, ASEAN member states, Vietnam and Philippines have expressed willingness to collaborate within the IPOI framework with India on the blue economy and also infrastructure as well. So my second point has a lot to do with India's ability to play a central role in the Quad's 3 working groups, as we know was launched during the Quad Summit. And this, I believe, kind of shifts the narrative a bit on how, the Quad is just simply a containment mechanism. There is real opportunity for tangible gains here for Southeast Asia. And India here plays a central role because of its own shared challenges with Southeast Asia. As we know, India is going to be the main production house of the vaccines for the Quad nations. They are right now on track to produce 1 billion vaccines for Southeast Asia and beyond through the Serum Institute of India and also Bharat Biotech. So we see how India plays a central role here. And this particular point, I feel, is very relevant because in this climate working group, in a time where we're talking about how vague it seems, it is right now based on the fact sheet. It talks about cooperation on climate mitigation, capacity building, and technology. So now India and Southeast Asia, they have very common traditional practices. And with those traditional practices comes shared challenges. For example, we talk about slash and burn agriculture, or zooming as it's known in India. So these have real, repercussions for how, its effect on the climate, with emissions of carbon gases and the like. And we talk also about rice production. India is one of the main rice producers in the region, along with many countries in Southeast Asia as well. And as we know, rice production accounts for about 1.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So here, India's common, this common feature that they share could be the Quad's way of cooperating better with Southeast Asia based on this main challenge. This could be one of their main pillars of how they approach the climate working group as well. Besides this carbon capture technology as well, so India has been making great strides in this, and Southeast Asia is also looking for ways to actually improve this area of cooperation as well. And this is where India can play a very important role for the Quad, and also how it eventually cooperates with Southeast Asia in this aspect. Moving on to the emerging tech group. So in January 2020, the Ministry of External Affairs India, they took the progressive step of creating something called NEST, which is the New and Emerging Strategic Technologies Division. And this, interestingly, is parked under the Ministry of External Affairs, which is, it's not in their communications or information division of not a national department. This is for the aim of actually collaborating internationally with foreign governments on how we can approach emerging tech. So this is a very clear indication of India's pronounced role in this particular working group. And obviously we know most countries, or not, if not all countries, face many forms of cybersecurity threats, and this could be the the platform where we can actually start cooperation with Southeast Asia on that front. And finally, my last point is that the nature and goals of India's intra-Quad bilateral partnerships and mini-lateral engagements with Quad members will determine the Quad's relevance in Southeast Asia. So I understand it's a mouthful, but maybe my explanation might explain it better. The India-US partnership, I believe, is especially important for the Quad and its acceptance in Southeast Asia. So this is a new Biden administration. And currently there are distinct commonalities between Washington's Asia policy and also New Delhi's Act East policy as well. And both of these emphasis primarily on the institutional centrality of ASEAN. So both countries are approaching Southeast Asia right now, as we know, with a new vehicle, but of course, old shared challenges, as we've seen in their Asia policies in the past. Harmonizing the approach to Southeast Asia here in this aspect by pooling resources, pursuing collaborative outreach methods, and also basically just endorsing each other as partners will be crucial for the Quad's relevance in Southeast Asia. The India-US Comprehensive Global Strategic Partnership is also contingent on ASEAN centrality. Also talking about a subset within the Quad, which is the Australia, India, Japan launched Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. So this one, of course, was launched because of the pandemic, on how supply chains broke down at that time temporarily. And this was a joint partnership to actually eventually create strong, sustainable supply chains. And of course, it aligns with the goals of the Quad, and it has the potential to align itself with other frameworks, such as the Blue Dot Network. Besides that, the 2+2 meetings with Japan, as we've seen recently with the Indian foreign ministers and Indian and Japan foreign ministers and defense ministers. So these have underscored the importance of infrastructure in their focus in infrastructure here. And especially when it comes to India-Japan relations, we talk about the Asia-Africa growth corridor as well. And it's immense focus on infrastructure here and how it could, collaborate with Asia better in this aspect. Finally, and last but definitely not least, India and Australia's relationship have reached great heights in the past few months, at least within the Quad framework and also bilaterally. And one good indication of this was Australia's interest in collaborating in the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative recently on maritime cooperation. So we see how that India is the central focus here in all these bilateral partnerships and also minilateral ones. And this could possibly get the Quad working with Southeast Asia a bit better. Just to conclude, India's prominent role in the Quad and prospects for collaboration with Southeast Asia is yet to be recognized by the region, in my opinion. This could be because of a number of reasons, and mainly because of the dominant narrative that it is simply a containment mechanism for China. But it is clear that with the launch of these 3 working groups, that the focus of non-traditional security, there is more reason to believe that it's more than just a containment mechanism. Southeast Asia must put national interests first when it comes to addressing these challenges and learn to better compartmentalize its priorities. India's presence in the Quad makes the mechanism more relatable, more palatable, which share challenges arising from common practices and, of course, similar predispositions. With India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative and its role with the Quad working groups, India could very well be the Quad's gateway to Southeast Asia. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Mina. We move on to our third speaker, Julio Amador. Julio is the interim president of the Foundation of for the National Interest, a new Philippine think tank that focuses on strategic and security issues. He's also the founder of the Philippine Strategic Forum, a website dedicated to strategic and international issues from a Filipino perspective. And I think prior to that, he was a long-serving civil servant for over a decade, focusing on foreign affairs and national security issue. Julio, it would be great to get a Southeast Asian perspective on this topic and on some of the things that both Mina and Brad have brought up. You have 10 minutes, Julio.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas. And let me just express my appreciation to the Malaysian Institute of Strategic International Studies, as well as the Australian High Commission in Malaysia for inviting me to this forum. What I'll be sharing are the results of the 2 surveys that Dr. Charmaine Willoughby, Dr. Aris Harugay, and I did on the perception of the Quad in the Philippines. We did 2 surveys, one in 2018 and one in 2019. Basically, it really captures the snapshot of the perceptions here in the Philippines. In our second survey, we had more than 600 respondents coming from the security sector at large. And I think that is illustrative of the interest that we have that's apparent on this issue. Now, the view of the Quad in the Philippines have drastically evolved from 2018 to 2019, owing to a number of regional developments, but generally speaking, the Philippines is positively welcoming the Quad. In our first survey in 2018, the results of which we published in 2019, the perception was that there was only a small majority of respondents who are familiar with the Quad as a multilateral security arrangement. Among the respondents who are aware of the Quad, most view it as a counterweight to China's increasing assertiveness in the Asia-Pacific. A majority of the respondents view that the Philippines can benefit from its participation in activities related to the Quad, and specifically, many believe that the Quad can manage tensions in the South China Sea and contribute to the Philippine government's pursuit of what it calls an independent foreign policy. While the Quad could potentially serve Philippine strategic interests, the respondents expressed caution that it may undermine ASEAN centrality and ASEAN-led regional security architecture. So the variance of perceptions among our Filipino security elites can be counted for in two ways. First is that there were disparities in Filipinos' reception of the Quad, which is symptomatic of the very ambiguities of the role of the arrangement in then US-Asia strategy. Second, the varying views of Filipinos stem from a deep knowledge of domestic politics, challenges to related long-haul strategy analysis, and biases related to trust and confidence in major powers such as China and the US. Now, in our second survey in late 2019, which we published in 2020, what we saw was a more coherent view of the Quad among Filipino security practitioners. The Quad was now viewed more systematically as important to the ASEAN-led security arrangement in Southeast Asia, and the population sample was more aware of the Quad's importance at the time of the pandemic. So what were the results of our second survey? First, Filipino security practitioners and observers are neutral when it comes to Quad undermining ASEAN centrality. We wrote that it was found that while the Quad does not compete with the ASEAN-led regional security architecture, our respondents were ambivalent about whether it undermines ASEAN centrality. Second is that Filipino security community view positively that the Quad can help manage tensions in the South China Sea, allowing other stakeholders to keep powers like Beijing in check. However, our respondents noted that participating in the Quad's activities will generate animosity with China. But despite this, the community are more open to participating in Quad activities should push comes to shove. Now, the support of the Quad is consistent with the population's view of who the Philippines' partners are when it comes to security. And our top five, also in the same survey, are first Japan, with 91.1%, who view Japan favorably. The second is the US, the third is Australia, the fourth is Indonesia, and the fifth is India. Now, despite the current government's attempt at shifting towards unorthodox security partners, support for these remain at an all-time low in contrast to the top five. China, for example, only gained 27.6% of support, which is lower than that of Taiwan's 39.5%, and Russia was only about 37.1%. So some recommendations that came from the survey was that if the Philippines is going to benefit from the Quad, must ensure that the trust and confidence towards Quad members are put to good use, most notably in enhancing the Philippines Armed Forces modernization trust. The Philippines could also participate in Quad activities that would uplift its international standing with law, most notably by participating in freedom of navigation operations either bilaterally or trilaterally with Quad member countries or jointly with all Quad member states. More importantly, the Philippines must be able to carefully calibrate the instrumental importance of the Quad parallel to its national interests. Our policymakers should be careful to use the Quad for enhancing peace, stability, and the rule of international law in the region more than inciting and provoking China. Basically, for the Quad as a whole, our recommendations from a Philippine perspective is that the Quad should be prepared to step in the seas when asked by the Philippines on matters pertaining to maritime security and other security challenges that all stakeholders see eye to eye with. For immediate results, the Philippine priorities based on our survey are the following. Security priorities are the following: COVID-19 pandemic, which is internal; terrorism and violent extremism, which is also internal; the communist insurgency, which is the third among the priorities of the security community; natural and human disasters, and external territorial defense. So these are the priorities that the Philippines hopes that should be prioritized by the Quad if and when cooperation can be done at a multilateral level. So Thomas, I'll leave it at that and then look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Julio. That was a pretty quick one. No worries. That means more time for Q&A. We now move on to our fourth and final speaker for the session, Dr. Wing Hong Sin. Dr. Sin is currently Vice President of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Prior to his current designation, he was the Deputy Director General of the Institute of Strategic Studies at the DAV. His research interests focus on major power relations, regional security governance, maritime security, and Vietnam's foreign policy. As a diplomat, Dr. Son has served as Minister Counselor of Vietnam's embassy in Canada and Second Secretary in Sweden. He has also served at the ASEAN Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. With this introduction, Dr. Son, you have 10 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for the very kind introduction. Thank you. Before at the outset, I'd like to thank Malaysia ISIS once again, as well as the Australian High Commissioner for the invitation to this very interesting webinars. Now, the problem of being the last speaker is that all the good ideas has already been spoken, and therefore I have very little else to say. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to emphasize some of the points I heard over the conversations, which I think I more or less agree, or I would like to add something on. First of all, I think the problem with Quad is not much on its China containment perception, but rather its sustainability. The perception that it would have some China containment will come up anyway, but we will soon go. And we've learned this from the past experience with ASEAN, with the ROF, and so on. ASEAN at its inception was seen as an Asian NATO too, particularly that by Beijing. But later on, as ASEAN evolves, that perception goes away. The ASEAN Regional Forum, as you may recall, at its inception in the early 1990s, was also seen as a gathering of Western as well as ASEAN countries in order to contain China. And China was at the beginning refrained from being a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum. And so that was, it's a natural reaction towards new multilateral settings in the region. And this is the problem that we will continue to see coming up. Actually, China would see anything that excludes China's membership, anything that's displayed, anything that the US leads in the region, and anything that focuses on the rules-based order as a China containment plot anyway. But that will go away as the institution develops and prove itself to be a different organization. My second point is that, on the other hand, Quad needs to really focus on its sustainability. At the moment, Quad is in its infancy, and the real question towards Quad is, what is the strategic glues that glues its members together? For ASEAN, we had this problem for some time, and the strategic glues we found out was that all ASEAN members stick to a common agenda of trying to stay strategically autonomous amid the great powers. And we haven't seen this kind of glues among the Quad as yet, or as strong the glues that we would like to see. In fact, there's a lot of vulnerabilities in the Quad members towards the Quad settings. While Australia, despite its steadfast commitment to the Quad at the moment, we do not know how its policy is going to change if there is a change in the US administration. Japan, at the moment, we are seeing a change in government. We do not know what's the policy direction of the new government will be. Will it hit a reset button towards its China relations, or will it step up its hedging towards China. India is also very vulnerable in its western flank, given Afghanistan, given its relationship with Pakistan, and so on, and can easily be distracted from its look east policy, despite all the rhetoric. And also India has a very complex relationship in the India-Russia-China triangle. And China, and given its non-aligned policy and its good relationship with Russia, we do not know how committed India will be towards the Quad. So the real questions of the Quad is to prove and to find the true reasons for its sustainability. Well, I then argue that a way for the Quad to have a common and long-term agenda is to actually work with ASEAN and also to focus on providing public goods in the region, a point that so many of you have previously emphasized. Why Quad needs to work with ASEAN? Because ASEAN is a 50-year-old institution. It provides plenty of legitimacy, and it has a strong institutional foothold in the region where it can provide Quad much of the services that Quad still lack at the moment. The question here that may arise is whether Quad is going to complement or is it going to compete with ASEAN, and I argue that there's elements of both. It is complementing to ASEAN because many of you pointed out ASEAN is a talk shop. ASEAN lacks the mechanisms to actually deliver the actual deliverables, but Quad is seemingly very strong and very focused on actually the deliverable. ASEAN, on the other hand, is very inclusive. ASEAN sets the regional agenda, sets the regional vision, and sets the basic framework and principles for all the Quad members actually in the ASEAN's institutional framework, whereas Quad can put those acts together and work in different smaller settings, minilateralism, in order to put those vision into actions and to arrive at the deliverable. So in that sense, there are much complementarity between ASEAN and the Quad, but there are some competing elements too. With a new kid on the block, ASEAN will face some comparison. ASEAN is going to feel the heat of being more critical from those who look for the outcome rather than the idealistic ones. And there is only so much bandwidth for regional diplomacy. And if there is another institutions that compete with ASEAN's diplomatically, for example, for symmetries, then ASEAN will face that kind of competition from Quad. The US presidents, for example, without COVID, on average, a US president only spend about 12 to 14 days abroad each year. And he probably will only travel once or twice to the Asia Pacific. If Quad is in existence in parallel to ASEAN, probably he will choose to go to Quad instead of going to the East Asia Summit, for example. So in that sense, there will be some competition, but the competition may be good. So therefore, I think the best way for ASEAN and Quad to coexist and to play their roles and complement one another is for them to find a way to work with one another. And there's been argument that if there's an ASEAN +3 setting, why not having another ASEAN +4 settings? Now it comes to the actual agendas on what ASEAN and Quad can work together that benefits Southeast Asia. I think there are plenty. There are a lot of things. On vaccine, for example, at the moment, all Southeast Asians are in need of vaccine and vaccines. But we do not just need to focus on vaccine production and immediate delivery. We can think longer term and think about vaccine production capability in the Indo-Pacific to tackle future pandemics. Things that we haven't yet seen. On climate, ASEAN and Quad can work together to focus on the human security aspect of climate, on HADR, for example. And also we can marry climate and technology to work on green climate, green technology that all Southeast Asia are aspiring to remodel their economies into. Infrastructure, well, I think this COVID situation, when all the economies are slowing down, is actually the best way to invest on infrastructure at the least costly manner, and that can be a window of opportunities for ASEAN and Quad to work on. Supply chain resilience. Supply chain resilience is very critically important with all this COVID breaking down supply chains, the sea lanes, the sea lanes of communications being affected by COVID situation. These are another areas that Quad and ASEAN can right now work onto to ensure the sustainability of the supply chains in the region. So there are so many other areas that can be of public goods and can be beneficial for ASEAN and Quad to collaborate without being seen as being strategically aligning against any country in the region. So let me stop there.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. And I think you have finished exactly on time, 9 minutes and 51 seconds. Very good. Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 20 minutes or slightly more for questions. Please do put them into the Q&A box for questions and comments. But in the meantime, allow me to start with 2 questions of my own before I turn it over to Iza. The first question really is for Brad, but it's also open to other speakers. Brad, you mentioned Build Back Better, and I think one of the initiatives that was pushed by Biden at the G7 summit was a Build Back Better world. And now, with 3 out of the 4 Quad members being part of the G7, do you think we could see the prospect, the prospect of the former, especially in this part of the world? A second question, if I may, is something more is directed more towards Julio and towards Dr. Sun, but also open to all of you. I wonder if it would be more productive for the Quad to adopt a minilateral approach for different issues when it comes to working with Southeast Asia. I mean, yes, ASEAN is a regional institution, but it is notoriously hobbled and often by its own design. So I'm thinking of the Malacca Straits Patrol, I'm thinking of the trilateral patrols in the Sulu Sea, which are all, these are generally security-focused arrangements, but they are minilateral arrangements and they involve the most affected countries. So perhaps the Quad might be better served by working with like-minded countries in Southeast Asia without depending too much on going through the entire excruciating ASEAN mechanism. Now, of course, not all Southeast Asians would agree with that, but I wonder what your thoughts be. Brad, maybe we can start with you.
Certainly. You're right to note the G7 adoption of the Build Back Better World, BBBGW, I think they're calling it, or the BB3W or something, whatever. And I think, the key is it goes to what we're not supposed to say, which is this is an attempt in this context to compete with the BRI, to undercut the idea that China is going to win influence in the world by virtue of its ability to provide, as I said, concrete improvements to the lives of the people that receive Chinese money. And with that money would, in theory, then go in political influence. So to the degree, of course, that the G7 is prepared to put its money literally where its mouth is, or where that statement is, then I think you will see some palpable gains, or at least, if you will, a diminution in the credit that China gets for its efforts. And that's really what this is all about, the opportunity, whether it goes to the Quad or some other G7 country. And this is where the engagement with Europeans, I think, matters so much. This is their opportunity for them to participate and to advance, if you will, the initiatives that improve the lives of people, and that then will unmistakably and without question carry on some political influence and hopefully win hearts and minds over and be more receptive to, supportive of the ideas that those particular governments are prepared to advance in other fora and in other ways. There's a lot more there, but I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you. Julio?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, it really doesn't hurt us to consider minilaterals. Now, the Quad itself is a minilateral, and I do think there are issues that are best done, or at least talked about and even acted upon in minilaterals. And if countries are willing to work with the Quad and the Quad are willing to work with these countries on specific issues, I do think we should promote that. Remember that even ASEAN is not the end all and be all of ASEAN member states. No? There's no shared foreign policy goal or no shared regional security perspective on many issues. So I don't see why we keep getting hobbled by this idea that the Quad should go through ASEAN if ASEAN member states themselves are quite willing to work with Quad on specific issues. And I think this brings me back to an earlier point in the session, or in the earlier session. We cannot, and I think it's to the credit of ASEAN that the Quad was formed in Manila in 2007 and then revived in 2017. So we cannot keep expecting, cannot keep saying that we are a platform for dialogue. We cannot keep inviting people to our parties and not expect them to talk to each other, right? So Quad is a result of ASEAN dialogues and mechanisms. So might as well be credited for it and work with it where we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Julio. I think that was really well put. ASEAN likes to keep talking. I know ASEAN keeps saying that it wants to talk and engage with everyone, but yet when we do invite them over, we want to set rules on what they can and cannot do, and who can speak to who and who cannot speak to who. One of the things about ASEAN, I guess, that it has to get in order, hopefully. Dr. Son, please.
Yes. Well, the question with minilateralism is that is if it will undermine multilateralism or generally if it will undermine ASEAN. But I tend to agree that it needs not to be seen that way. As long as the minilateralism promoted by Quad or facilitated by Quad is in line with ASEAN visions, is in line with the set out ASEAN's principles, that should be encouraged, because that will actually is the realistic way of delivering on the ASEAN ambitions and ASEAN's programs and objectives. So instead of seeing minilateralism, Quad or Quad plus or Quad minus or whatever, working with several ASEAN member states as a challenge or as an undermining of ASEAN centrality, ASEAN should actually encourage those efforts that is in line with ASEAN purposes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Son. So the drilling next door has started again, which is a really good time for me to turn this over to my co-moderator, Iza, to take this discussion forward. Iza, are you here? I hope you're here.
Yes, I am here. Don't worry.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Iza. I'll be taking over as co-moderator. I unfortunately do not have a very fun drill sound effect in the background, so you're going to have to bear with. Yeah, we do have a few questions already lined up. And this is also to the audience as well, that please do feel free to keep asking. But though it is subject to time and how long our participants will discuss on each question. So the first question actually came from one of our speakers from the previous session. We have Haley, who did ask a question directed to Mina. She's asking that in reference to the supply chain resilience initiative that was described earlier, why wasn't the US involved in this? If you could elaborate.
Hi, Iza. Thank you so much for the question. So yes, we were actually talking about that a bit earlier. Well, I do feel that there are synergies between the Blue Dot Network and also the SCRI. And right now with the American push for, cooperating, as we've already seen, cooperating with like-minded countries and all that, I do think that the Blue Dot Network has already had their own goals and objectives already. And this, the subset of Japan, Australia, and US, it's already been, kind of established already before. And so this sort of synergy between the SCRI and BDN, it can obviously, reach a point where they can meet and also cooperate. But right now it's too independent, and this is okay as well, because within the Quad, I mean, there should be an encouraging amount of bilateral, trilateral partnerships within the Quad to make it a bit more individualistic as well. I mean, we want to see individual countries actually showing what they can offer, what they can put to the table as well. And although in the long run, if we see some kind of synergy between the BDN and SCRI in the future, this could, lead to something else. And this could actually lead to, ASEAN actually cooperating with them a bit more later as well. So this is how I see it playing out. All Quad members don't have to work on everything together. They can also work, individually as well. And this is, I guess, one of the main reasons why, India has not been inserted into the BDN yet.
Do you, and also this is just actually quite a good follow-up. There's another question asking for not just to Mina, so if you have any input, and also to Brad, as you have mentioned this a bit, discussed a bit of this earlier, could any of the speakers enlighten on the progress or development of the Blue Dot Network up to this point in time? Mina, if you have any points first.
Okay, so just a few things. One very important development from the BDN was the fact that some of the certification criteria that was laid out by the BDN was actually endorsed by G20 countries, and this includes China as well. So this was a very interesting development, and it actually goes to show that perhaps that if it's actually a common good, perhaps more countries will actually come forward and be open to collaborating within these frameworks, which so-called who have previously actually been alleged as being very ganged up, or just being very small, where there's no other countries who can come and join it. But this actually shows that there is intent from other countries that BDN could be something that can expand further. So yeah, this is what I know from a recent reading of mine.
Thanks. Brad?
There's a couple of threads here that are both entangled and need to be separated and should be more entangled. Around the time of the G7, there was an OECD meeting, and you take a look, and they were actually endorsing Build Back Better World and BDN. So you might, if you go to the OECD website, I believe there's some information about that discusses a way to, in fact, and the appropriate phrase is to reinvigorate BDN, because while it was announced in 2019 with a lot of fanfare, there was never a lot of guts behind it. I think it was an empty website that pretty much went to the dark side of the web. When you tried to follow the clicks, there was never a lot of substance to it. And I think that they've decided that it was a good idea, but poorly delivered. And thus there's an interest in really pumping it up and making it into something more substantive. And again, I think as Yina said, that it would be, the degree to which the G20 endorses it, in which the Chinese would come on board, it would be helpful to demonstrate that, in fact, whether we call it BDN, whether it's part of the Build Back Better World initiative, or even part of the BRI, the degree to which we can all act on consistently with a shared set of principles of value, or values laid out, principles and ideas about the appropriate form of investment, that would, I think, demonstrate, it would diminish some of the heat, would show an openness, if you will, to greater inclusivity and to expand the range of initiatives in ways that might decrease some heat around the Quad, around this program in general, and always demonstrate that in fact, the objective is to improve the lives of as many people as possible, and not to get submerged or immersed or stuck.
Okay, no, that's muted. Okay, thank you. And this is another question that I would like to direct to our Southeast Asian panelists. So to both Mr. Julio, Dr. Sun, and Mina. So the members of the Quad seems quite intent on reassuring ASEAN that the Quad isn't directed towards China or in any sort of containment means that they have. But don't you believe that at some level, Southeast Asia would benefit from an arrangement that could potentially scale up to push back against Beijing and keep them honest in some shape or form? Mr. Julio, you can start first.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we also have some agency in the way that we conduct our foreign policy, right? And I think we can allude earlier to discussions about whether China needs to be reassured. But if you notice, our behavior in Southeast Asia is that we keep wanting US reassurance primarily, and now Quad reassurance secondarily. And I think that speaks well to our own anxieties and how to deal with China as a partner. No? in many ways, we have always asked the Quad so many things about how to reassure us and what they should be doing. We have not asked the same of China in particular. So that leaves me wondering, what do we want from the Quad ourselves now? And I think the answer to that is that we really do want the security assurances that only the US can give, and now that the Quad can give as a team, as a minilateral. And hopefully this would extend into those critical areas that we were talking about, the South China Sea, cybersecurity, and technology. Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up just before I pass to Dr. Sun. I just really want to latch on that comment where you said that ASEAN or Southeast Asia doesn't seem to know what they want. Do you think this is a general issue for the region, or is it just also because, given the current state of a lot of the countries, that it's a bit harder to be able to realize or to actually settle on what do we need to prioritize at the moment?
Part of it is, of course, how to prioritize, given that the pandemic is overtaking some of our plans nationally and in ASEAN. But I do think that we haven't really agreed what should be the next step. Now, even our ASEAN ideas for the Indo-Pacific haven't really taken a foothold. So at the end of the day, a lot of ASEAN countries are free to partner or disassociate themselves from the Quad, but I don't think that we have reached a consensus on what to do with Quad, the same way that we have reached a consensus on many security issues as well, and not just the South China Sea.
Thank you very much. And we'll move on to Dr. Sun now.
Well, I think definitely ASEAN countries is going to benefit a lot from the strategic stabilities that Quad is going to provide. But that need not to be seen or need not to be portrayed as a pushback against China. If Quad is to strengthen maritime security, for example, if Quad is to strengthen the rules-based international order, if Quad helps countries to better understand, implement, enforce the law of the sea, for example, that need not to be seen as an effort to push back against China. That's all about strategic stability. It's all about strengthening the rules-based international order. So yes, Quad is definitely helpful, definitely strategic, and should be seen as an effort to strengthen stability, but not to be seen as directed towards China. Anybody, well, if Vietnam, for example, try to undermine the law of the sea by whatever, then it should be against Vietnam as well, and any other countries as well.
Right. And then the last one for this one, Mina, if you have any remarks.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Isa. I totally agree with Mr. Julio and Dr. Sun as well. I do feel that Southeast Asia countries, they need to, they need to be empowered to actually care more about their national interests and not so much about who they're making happy or whom they're making sad. I mean, at the end of the day, if the Quad or even India's Pacific Oceans Initiative is going to help them in some way, why don't you go for it? I mean, what is this necessity to actually, try and hedge between, other countries to see which fits your national interests? I mean, if infrastructure from the Quad helps you, by all means go for it. I mean, I guess it's this particular mentality that kind of makes ASEAN very meek in that aspect when it comes to dealing with the Quad. And so I do believe that this is definitely something to think about. I mean, if you think about India's IPOI, it's based on India's Act East policy, and it's based on the engagement with Southeast Asia. So why hasn't there been a greater, intent to cooperate with India in that aspect? There hasn't been any. And for me, in the back of my head, it's only because of the China factor. And so I think that countries need to put their national interests, at the forefront, and work with anybody who wishes to work with them, as long as it kind of benefits them in some way. So yeah, that's what I have to say for that.
Can I weigh in on this?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that Dr. Song, as usual, is right on, and as Yina, the issue is stability. The issue is the question of Southeast Asians, like many countries, are very pragmatic, and so what needs to happen is we need to have organizations and institutions and forums that solve problems. And to the degree that the Quad can do that, to the degree that it provides stability and addresses the issues, then it's providing a public good, and it will be supported. The question that I think we tend to sort of overlook is the degree to which we're prepared to give China a veto over the activities of this or any other organization. And you don't have to be anti-Chinese. The question is, to what degree is China, and I think again, Dr. Sung mentioned this in his remarks, prepared to tolerate or countenance institutions that might at some point check Chinese ambitions? And it's not up to China to be given a blank check. I think it's up to all of us to decide at some particular point where it is that we draw lines and who we look at as the transgressor. And none of us, including the United States, should be above reproach and should be, given the opportunity to stop other countries from maintaining the stability and maintaining the rules-based order that seems to benefit the most people. And we tend to forget, we tend to immediately conflate Chinese objectives with rightful objections, when in fact it is China pursuing its own national interest, but we don't necessarily have to concede to that or to give them that veto, if you will, over the larger set of interests and actions that we would care to take.
Actually, this is a really good segue, because the question directed for Brad actually is also on the topic of stability and instability, and also time to pull out your credentials as a Japanese expert. So this is regarding to the question that is Japan returning to an era of political instability? This is especially in light with Prime Minister Suga announcing that he will not be continuing. And this also reminds us that prime ministers do get replaced on quite a regular basis. So would this change, this quite a common change, be a limiting factor on Japan's effectiveness as a member of the Quad?
I don't think so. But they're very different questions. I mean, number one, I'm concerned that we are, yes, re-entering periods of instability in Japanese politics. And that's, my book argues that Abe was quite unique. And I mean, having been the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history, that definitely makes him unique. I'm afraid that Suga is going to be typical for a period of churn for some time. That said, on the other hand, the direction of Japanese foreign policy, I believe, is going to be set that you have a very powerful and very functional, very capable bureaucracy that will continue to implement and advance these initiatives, because I think there is a broad consensus about them being consistent with the Japanese national interest. And there's none of the contenders that I see in the prime minister, either now or the next couple of iterations, that would challenge those. So I do not believe that there will be, I believe that there may be great instability in the Conte, the prime minister's office, but I don't think you'll see great shifts or swings in foreign policy. It's fairly well anchored and will continue to stay on the course that it's on.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, so now we have a more tech inclined question. I'm kind of going to leave this open and if anyone has any thoughts on this. So on the future, so Farlina Syed has asked, for the future trajectories of technology, as the working group does state that they are aiming to develop a coordinated approach on technology principles, standards, and supply chains. And this is also the aspect of working with a broad range of partners. Would this be galvanizing the private sector? As you have to bear in mind that the majority of big tech companies are in the US. And how would this impact the standards or principles practiced in other countries? And would it create more tensions in other coordinating and norm building exercises for responsible state behavior? It's a bit of a doozy, I know.
If people don't mind me talking more, I mean, this is actually something I'm doing a lot of work on, and I'm hoping my next book will actually be about this subject. There are two sort of related sets of questions. The first has to do with international standards more broadly, and you're seeing that that's every government now has awakened to the importance of playing a role in standard setting. And China is perhaps really, really important in catalyzing this interest, and you're seeing a real sense that this is where so much of the competition in digital and network economics is lying, that the implications of setting standards is so great that people have to, and the countries have to be much more involved. So I think you're beginning to see this playing out both, and I would watch it both at the global level at the ITU and places like that, as well as in the regional organizations. Watch how smart cities initiatives progress. Watch how the ASEAN connectivity initiatives work out with the various partners that they do. That's where I think the real action is going to be. But that is a separate question on some degree to what's going on with the United States, because quite frankly, the US is still working out, at least under the Biden administration and under its predecessor, where tech policy was going to go and the degree to which controls were going to be implemented and how permeable they were going to be. The truth is that we are in a very international stage of tech R&D, that most of the important collaborations are multinational. And so you've got to be real careful about where you draw the lines and who you let into the laboratories and who you see the work. But I think there are two, while it goes back to my first point in my presentation about technology lies at the heart of so much of the future of the competition, because that's what will in many ways determine success or failure in an economic competition. That at the same time, number one, the tech companies know, both in the United States and elsewhere, they know that they really need access to the Chinese market, because there's so much money there, and something like a quarter of R&D revenues are being generated by sales to China. So cutting off China both denies them of those funds and denies them of collaboration. At the same time, however, the truth is, while we don't talk a lot about it, the greatest promoter, one of the greatest promoters globally of indigenization and of cutting off access to technology has been China. That they're really promoting both domestic standards, domestic producers, domestic competitors, and knocking foreign competitors out of very, very important markets. So it's a really, really important question. Most of the key issues are not resolved, and there are tensions in there that frankly are going to leave people unhappy no matter where the resolution is. But it is, in my mind, this question of technology, economics, international relations that are reflected and reflect that is going to be one of the most important issues that we face. And it goes well beyond supply chain issues, which is ultimately a security question. And what we're really talking about is in terms of, I think, leadership, global dominance, setting standards, which then will flow through. You have to understand how broad these technologies interact, and the way that your mastery, for example, of AI will then filter through so many other fields, including renewable energy or telecommunications networks, et cetera, just in ways that promote efficiencies or promote ways of governance and of administering states that will have profound implications literally for the way that countries are run, both on a normative, normative and effective standards.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me deal with that technical difficulty. But at the same time, do any of our other speakers have any comments or to add on regarding the question of technology and big tech right now?
Let me just weigh in, of course, not on the very technical aspect, but also just about India's role in this, especially within the Quad framework. For India right now, there's already been a lot of, intent for cooperation on a people-to-people level, especially. When we think about India's way of cooperating with ASEAN, there's a lot of intent for people to connect via, technical institutes, for example. So India has the IITs, the BITS Pilanis, the NITs as well. And these actually have immense potential to actually have more information sharing, knowledge sharing capacities. So I guess India's role in this, in this working group especially, will play a major role on a very unit level. So there's just people's level, especially. And that's what I would say, within the Quad as well. So that's all. Thank you.
Anybody else on this? Because if not, we'll be moving on to our closing remarks or any other closing thoughts from our speakers. Okay, I think we'll just move on to that. So Dr. San, maybe you can start if you have any final remarks.
Well, I think there's clear benefit of better interactions between Quad and Southeast Asia, just so we understand more of Quad's purposes and capabilities. Just now we had a conversation about technology, which is really over my head. And I believe that most of us do not fully yet understand what is the capability to deliver through technology, through climate change that Quad members can offer to ASEAN. So I think this kind of conversation is really beneficial. If not at the official level, we can do so at the track 1.5 or track 2. Secondly, I think if Quad is at the infancy and does not have a proper secretariat yet, well, maybe ASEAN Secretariat can offer some secretariat service to Quad members, just so you can keep your files in order as you grow for a start. That's it. Thank you.
Then to Mr. Julio, on to you.
Thank you. In many ways, the Quad is really the result of ASEAN's successes or whatnot. No? And I think we should give a lot of credit to ASEAN for that. We've always criticized the US before for just having freedom of navigation operations as their primary tool in keeping stability in Southeast Asia. Now that the US and its allies and partners have the Quad as a mechanism, we're criticizing it again for trying to lure us into a new Cold War or something like that. I do think that we're never going to be satisfied. And I agree with Mita earlier that perhaps countries should really understand what their own foreign policy and national security priorities will be so that they will not be left out. Now, if they come to terms with what the Quad is doing and not doing. And I think there was a question earlier here about RCEP, which I think is critical because 2 members of the Quad are members of the RCEP. And that speaks to ASEAN success. No, RCEP is not a China creation; it is an ASEAN creation. The fact that we have members of the Quad there actually speaks a lot about the viability of ASEAN mechanisms. Still, the fact that also that when the Vice President of the US came here and spoke about inviting of convening APEC in the US in 2023, that is not the economic policy that we were looking for. No, and I think that speaks also to how the US and its partners should galvanize themselves on this front, precisely because there are only going to be more winners if we work on the economic front. But at the same time, let's not forget, if the Quad challenges ASEAN, it's not necessarily ASEAN's or the Quad's fault. It's our fault with ASEAN for always looking for low-hanging fruits in our own mechanisms. Thank you very much.
Okay. And on to Mina now.
Okay, for my closing remarks, first of all, I'd just like to thank everyone for a stellar panel, and I was a bit out of my depths here, but I really did try my best to share my thoughts here. Thank you. For my closing remarks, I'd just like to say that as much as the Quad is being viewed with apprehension maybe in Southeast Asia, but as much as the Quad is trying to, show ASEAN like, hey, we're actually, trying to do something here. We're trying to do something tangible. There are tangible outputs here. It takes 2 hands to clap, honestly. If the Quad is coming and saying that, hey, we have certain things that we want to cooperate with, the, ASEAN member states or Southeast Asia as a whole needs to be receptive of that, needs to understand their own national interests, their own national standings on all these issues, and learn how to better prioritize, better compartmentalize these interests. And also don't only always go back to that that narrative that okay, you know what, we're a bit, we don't want to be in the middle of this US-China thing. Let's not go to the US-China thing. Let's think about what's important for us. Let's talk about whether this infrastructure, cooperation, whether maritime cooperation actually helps us, and let's go with that. I mean, until today, before the announcement of the working groups, we've been talking about security alliance. We've been talking about the so-called Asian NATO and all that. But with these working groups, there is a real indication that it is going to be a more something that can actually produce more tangible outputs, and especially directed to Southeast Asia. We can see the vaccines going, the 1 billion vaccines going to Southeast Asia. This is a very clear indication of that. So I think the region needs to take account of what it means, especially nationally, and just cooperate with the Quad wherever it sees fit. And yeah, that's a good start for Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. And Brad, you're lucky last.
And I'm having technical issues, so I hope I get this in, which will encourage me to be brief. Let me make 2, I think, really simple points. The first is, as I said earlier, this isn't terribly a new initiative. I mean, the Quad is in many ways working out just like the old coalitions of the willing, an opportunity for like-minded countries to get together and address problems. So I don't think we should be too concerned about it as some sort of dangerous or threatening new institution. Second, related to that. And this is, I think, is a conundrum for particularly what was explained in the points in the first panel, and that is the Quad success, as in any institution at this time, is going to be a function of its ability to address the problems that affect people's lives and make them better. And I'm sorry I sound like a broken record, but the way that that's going to happen is it's going to occur in the efforts of the working groups that are going to be technical, that are going to get down in the weeds, that address, like one of the questions said, about IPR rights, that's able to address connectivity issues, that are going to ultimately be very, very mundane or technical issues that most people are not going to be able to understand or really appreciate, except insofar as it deals with their lives. And so the ability then to sell the Quad on these grand gestures at this 35,000 foot level where most of us seem to be so comfortable, it's going to be a lot of empty talk, because what we're really going to have to focus on are these technical details that are down in the weeds. And so the disjuncture and the disconnect between that really high level conversation that we have to get public approval and the low level work that's actually going to make a difference is going to be very difficult to bridge. But that's where the effort has to go. And I think the degree to which we then focus on that technical work and on really, really the nuts and bolts issues of daily life in those particulars of the working group will be the way in which we demonstrate that the Quad is meaningful, that it is not just a geopolitical tool, and that it really is about making substantive differences in the lives of billions of people.
Thank you. And with that, we shall move on to Thomas now. Thank you.
Thanks, Isa. Hope your green screen stands the test of time before we end this webinar. Thank you to all our speakers and to Shariman and Sinatra for moderating the first session, and to High Commissioner Dr. Lee for giving us the welcoming remarks. This has been a very, very productive webinar. I'm not going to attempt to summarize all that's been discussed, except to say that it's really interesting to notice how conversations, even on the non-traditional, the non-security bit, when conversations go around tech, they go around the economy, they go around what the Quad can do in terms of pandemic. Everything keeps coming back to the broader strategic picture, and the other thing that stood out is that, as much as ASEAN wants the Quad to be so many things, it still doesn't have a fixed answer of what it really wants from the Quad. It has broad ideas with no real specific outcomes, and when our partners approach us with different ideas, we seem to know a lot of what we don't want, but we're just not sure of what we want, which is perhaps a long-standing problem for Southeast Asia. I don't know if we can ever truly get what we want when we have 10 different, 10 different countries looking in 10 different directions sometimes. But in saying that, allow me to thank all the panelists again. Ladies and gentlemen, the recording for this webinar will be available on our website by tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. So follow our social media channels, and we will tweet and post it on Facebook when it's up, so you can access the recordings. Thank you again to all 106 of you, well, 105 now, who have stayed till the end. We do appreciate your time, and we look forward to you joining us at a future ISIS forum. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
you.